Marvin Gaye was the undisputed voice of a generation, a man whose vulnerability and soul became the literal soundtrack to Black excellence and romance. To the public, he was a shimmering icon of spiritual and social awakening. But behind the velvet curtain of the recording studio, a different story was brewing among his peers. While the world worshipped at the altar of Marvin's genius, some of the most disciplined figures in the industry held a far more critical view. Why would Verdine White, a man defined by the harmony, spiritual precision, and brotherhood of earth, wind, and fire, reportedly harbor such deep-seated resentment toward the Prince of Motown? Did the friction stem from professional envy, or was it a visceral reaction to the chaos that followed Marvin everywhere he went? Earth, Wind, and Fire versus Marvin Gaye, two completely different worlds of Black music. To understand the friction that existed behind the velvet curtains of the 1970s soul scene, one must first recognize that Earth, Wind, and Fire and Marvin Gaye represented two diametrically opposed philosophies of Black artistry. On one side stood a collective built on the foundation of a spiritual military. On the other stood a lone wolf navigating the heights of ecstasy and the depths of psychological warfare. Maurice White founded Earth, Wind, and Fire with a rigid, almost monastic vision. He demanded total sobriety, intense physical fitness, and a shared devotion to Egyptian philosophy and cosmic unity. Verdine White was the visual and rhythmic heartbeat of this machine. For the White brothers, music was a tool for elevation and a business that required absolute precision. Their stage shows were marvels of engineering, featuring pyrotechnics and levitating drum kits that functioned with the clockwork accuracy of a Swiss watch. To them, being an artist meant being a leader, a professional, and a beacon of discipline. Marvin Gaye operated in a completely different atmosphere. While Earth, Wind, and Fire looked toward the stars, Marvin was often trapped within the labyrinth of his own mind. He was the quintessential tortured genius, an artist who could not separate his divine gift from his personal demons. By the mid-70s, Marvin had moved away from the polished hit factory of Motown to become a revolutionary, but that independence came at a heavy cost. His creative process was fueled by emotional volatility, erratic schedules, and an increasing reliance on substances to numb the pressures of his status. The tension between these two worlds was inevitable. For a man like Verdine White, who spent his life perfecting his craft and maintaining the integrity of a global brand, Marvin Gaye represented a dangerous level of unpredictability. Verdine saw the importance of the group, the legacy, and the responsibility to the audience. Marvin, conversely, was often late to his own performances or canceled them entirely, driven by paranoia or a sudden shift in mood. This was not merely a difference in musical style, it was a clash of values. Earth, Wind, and Fire symbolized the power of the collective and the strength found in order. Marvin Gaye symbolized the fragility of the individual and the chaos that often accompanies unbridled talent. When these two paths crossed in the high-stakes environment of Los Angeles and the international touring circuit, and the result was a quiet but profound resentment. It was the frustration of the disciplined watching the gifted throw it all away. To the public, they were all icons of the same golden era, but within the industry, they lived in two different universes that were destined to collide. Before the fallout, how Verdine White first crossed paths with Marvin Gaye in 1970s Hollywood. The early 1970s in Los Angeles served as a melting pot for Black musical royalty. Hollywood was the epicenter of a cultural shift where the soulful grit of Detroit and Chicago met the polished glamour of the West Coast. During this era, Verdine White was a young, energetic bassist, helping his brother Maurice build the foundation of Earth, Wind, and Fire. They were the new kids on the block, hungry and hyper-focused. Meanwhile, Marvin Gaye was already a deity of the industry, transitioning from the tailored suits of the Motown charm school into the raw, socially conscious visionary who gave the world what's going on. The paths of these artists first crossed in the tight-knit circles of the Los Angeles recording scene and the high-end clubs where musicians gathered after hours. In those days, the Sunset Strip and the studios of Hollywood were small worlds. You could find the members of Earth, Wind, and Fire honing their craft at Sunset Sound, while Marvin Gaye was tucked away in his own creative sanctuary, often working late into the night. To a young Verdine White, Marvin was initially a figure of immense stature. He was the man who had redefined what a Black male artist could be. He was both a sex symbol and a philosopher, a combination that Earth, Wind, and Fire would later emulate in their own spiritual way. However, the initial awe began to fade as the realities of professional life set in. The 1970s was a decade of excess, and Hollywood was the playground for every imaginable temptation. Verdine White and his bandmates were famous for their no-nonsense approach to the industry. Maurice White ran the group with the discipline of a drill sergeant. They showed up early, They practiced for hours, and they maintained a clean image that reflected their elevated lyrical themes. They were building a legacy based on reliability and collective strength. Marvin Gaye was moving in the opposite direction. While his music remained brilliant, his personal life was becoming a series of missed appointments and emotional outbursts. Peers in the industry began to notice the inconsistencies. At industry parties or joint concert lineups, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Verdine and his brothers would arrive as a unified front, radiant in their elaborate costumes and focused on the mission. Marvin would often arrive late, surrounded by a cloud of hangers-on, looking physically exhausted or mentally checked out. The first real seeds of friction were planted when the professional expectations of the White brothers met the erratic nature of Gaye. In the high-pressure environment of 1970s Hollywood, time was money. If a legendary artist like Marvin Gaye held up a production or caused a delay in a shared space, it did not sit well with the disciplined camp of Earth, Wind, and Fire. Verdine, who took immense pride in the technical mastery and the rhythmic heartbeat of his band, saw Marvin's lack of structure as a slight against the music itself. By the mid-70s, the admiration Verdine once held for the Motown legend started to curdle into a form of professional disdain. He saw a man who had been given every gift imaginable, but seemed intent on dismantling his own life through indulgence and lack of focus. For Verdine, the music was a sacred responsibility. For Marvin, the music was increasingly becoming a secondary thought to his personal battles. This period in Hollywood was the calm before the storm, a time when the two parties were still cordial on the surface, but the fundamental differences in their character were becoming glaringly obvious to everyone behind the scenes. Marvin was trouble. The rumors that followed, Marvin Gaye, everywhere. By the late 1970s, the golden boy of Motown had transformed into a figure of intense concern and frustration within the inner circles of the music industry. While the public still viewed Marvin Gaye through the lens of his smooth vocal delivery and his spiritual activism, those who worked alongside him began to see a man governed by chaos. The rumors were no longer just whispers in the hallways of record labels. They had become the defining characteristics of his daily existence. Marvin was developing a reputation for being impossible to manage, a label that carried a heavy weight in an era where studio time was expensive and touring logistics were grueling. The most persistent rumors centered on his deepening struggle with cocaine addiction. It was an open secret that Marvin's creative bursts were often fueled by substances that simultaneously eroded his reliability. For a perfectionist like Verdine White, who belonged to a band that practiced with the intensity of an Olympic team, this was an unforgivable breach of professional conduct. Musicians started sharing stories of Marvin disappearing for days at a time, leaving producers and session players waiting in expensive studios while he chased his next high or fell into a state of deep depression. Financial ruin followed close behind his personal instability. Despite earning millions from his massive catalog, Marvin was perpetually broke. The IRS was a constant shadow in his life, leading to rumors that he was hiding money or fleeing the country to avoid his tax obligations. This financial desperation created a toxic environment where Marvin often felt exploited by the very industry that had made him a star. He began to view everyone with suspicion, and this paranoia started to bleed into his professional relationships. Peers noticed that he was becoming increasingly isolated, pulling away from the friends and mentors who had supported him during his early years at Motown. Then there was the volatility of his personal relationships, specifically his marriage to Janice Hunter. The drama of their union was common knowledge in the Los Angeles music scene. Reports of explosive arguments, public scenes, and mutual toxicity were frequent. For the members of Earth, Wind, and Fire, who prided themselves on a public image of harmony and black love in its most elevated form, Marvin's private life looked like a cautionary tale. Verdine White lived in a world where the group's message of spiritual enlightenment was reflected in their conduct. To see a man of Marvin's stature embroiled in such messy public dysfunction created a significant cultural divide. The industry also buzzed with stories of Marvin's erratic behavior during live performances. There were nights when he would skip sound checks entirely, leaving his band to scramble. On other occasions, he would stop a show in the middle of a set to deliver long, rambling monologues that left the audience confused. This lack of respect for the stage was a direct affront to the philosophy of the White brothers. Earth, Wind, and Fire viewed the stage as a sacred space where the artist owed the audience a flawless experience. Marvin's tendency to treat the stage as a therapy couch was seen by many as a sign of a man who had lost his way. As these rumors solidified into a known reality, the gap between Marvin Gaye and the rest of the soul elite widened. He was becoming a liability. Promoters were hesitant to book him, and fellow artists were wary of collaborating with him. The tragedy was that everyone knew the brilliance was still there, buried under layers of addiction and mental fatigue. But for Verdine White and those who prioritized discipline, the genius no longer excused the trouble. They saw a legend who was effectively burning down his own house, while the rest of the industry watched in a mixture of horror and judgment. Marvin was no longer just an artist, he was a walking crisis, and the people who valued order and longevity began to distance themselves before the inevitable collapse occurred. Motown, fame, and emotional collapse. The internal culture of Motown Records played a massive role in shaping the person Marvin Gaye became, but it also served as the primary source of his deepest resentments. To understand why Verdine White and other industry professionals might have viewed Marvin's trajectory with such harsh judgment, one must look at the specific way Motown functioned. It was often described as a hit factory, a place where artists were molded, polished, and packaged for mainstream consumption. While this system created some of the greatest music in history, it also created a high-pressure environment that rewarded performance over personal well-being. By the time Earth, Wind, and Fire reached their peak, they had built their own infrastructure outside of that old-school system, allowing them a level of control and health that Marvin never truly mastered. Marvin Gaye was a product of the Berry Gordy era, a time when artists were expected to be grateful and compliant. For years, Marvin felt like a puppet, forced to sing light-hearted love songs while his soul was yearning to speak on the pain of the world. When he finally broke free with the release of the What's Going On album, he won a battle for his creative soul, but the war for his mental stability was only beginning. The fame that followed was suffocating. Marvin found himself in a position where he was the emotional conscience of Black America, a title he never felt stable enough to hold. This weight led to a slow but visible emotional collapse that played out in front of his peers. In the late 70s and early 80s, stories began to circulate about Marvin betraying the trust of those within his professional circle. These were not just stories of missed studio sessions, but of a man who had become increasingly difficult to rely on for basic human commitments. There were reports of Marvin borrowing significant sums of money from fellow musicians and industry insiders to fund his lifestyle or his habit, only to disappear when it was time to settle the debt. In the world of Verdine White, where honor, brotherhood, and collective responsibility were the primary laws of the group, this behavior was seen as a profound betrayal of the community. Verdine White lived by a code of extreme discipline. Maurice White had instilled a sense of purpose in Earth, Wind, and Fire that extended beyond the music. They practiced transcendental meditation, maintained a strict diet, and treated their touring schedule with the seriousness of a military operation. To Verdine, seeing a man as gifted as Marvin Gaye fall into a cycle of self-destruction was not just a tragedy, it was a source of active frustration. There is a specific kind of anger that disciplined people feel when they watch a genius waste their potential. From the perspective of the Earth, Wind, and Fire camp, Marvin was not just a victim of his circumstances. He was a man who was failing to take responsibility for his own life. The industry's silence surrounding Marvin's destructive behavior only added to the tension. Because Marvin was a superstar and a massive revenue generator, many people around him were willing to enable his worst impulses, as long as he could still occasionally deliver a hit. This enablement created a bubble of delusion around Marvin, one where he felt he was untouchable, despite the fact that his life was falling apart. Insiders would whisper about his erratic mood swings and his withdrawal from the social scene, yet the public only saw the icon. For artists like Verdine, who were actually doing the hard work of maintaining a professional organization, the protection Marvin received felt like a slap in the face to those who chose the path of sobriety and focus. As the 1980s approached, the emotional collapse was nearly complete. Marvin was often seen as a shadow of his former self, plagued by a sense of isolation that he had largely created. He moved to Europe to escape his debts and his demons, but the reputational damage back in the United States was already done. The stories of his behavior had become legendary. While some peers looked on with pity, others, like Verdine, likely saw a man who had chosen chaos over the spiritual and professional order that defined their own careers. It was a fundamental disagreement on what it meant to be a Black man in the spotlight. One group chose to be a pillar of strength and reliability, while the other became a symbol of the fragile fading flame of a genius who could no longer handle the heat of his own fame. The night Marvin Gaye allegedly humiliated fellow musicians backstage. The reality of touring in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a grueling test of character and professional endurance. While the audience saw the finished product of lights and choreography, the backstage area was a pressure cooker where an artist's true temperament was revealed. For many who shared the stage with Marvin Gaye during this period, the experience was less about musical collaboration and more about managing the unpredictable moods of a superstar in decline. One specific night has lived on in industry lore as a turning point for how many of his peers, potentially including members of the Earth, Wind, and Fire circle, viewed his professional integrity. Reports from that evening describe an atmosphere of extreme tension before the first note was even played. Fellow musicians, some of whom were respected veterans in their own right, had arrived early to ensure every technical detail was perfect. They understood the high stakes of a major production. Marvin, however, was reportedly hours late, arriving in a state that many described as agitated and deeply paranoid. Rather than offering the standard professional courtesies, he allegedly began to berate the band and the support staff in front of other industry peers. The humiliation was not just about the tardiness, it was about the way Marvin reportedly used his status to diminish the contributions of others. He was known to halt rehearsals to criticize minor mistakes with a biting personal edge that felt more like an emotional venting session than a constructive musical critique. To a man like Verdine White, who viewed his fellow bandmates as brothers and co-architects of his spiritual mission, this behavior was a fundamental violation of the performer's code. In the Earth, Wind, and Fire camp, respect was the currency that kept the machine running. Seeing a legend treat world-class musicians like disposable servants created a rift that was difficult to bridge. As the night progressed, the paranoia that had been simmering in Marvin's private life boiled over into the professional workspace. He reportedly began to accuse those around him of sabotage or theft, creating an environment of fear rather than creativity. This was the era where Marvin started wearing bulletproof vests and surrounding himself with security personnel who felt more like a private militia than a protection detail. The contrast between this dark defensive energy and the uplifting communal vibe of a group like Earth, Wind, and Fire was staggering. For the musicians who had to endure these outbursts, the pain was compounded by the fact that they still respected Marvin's genius. They were caught in a trap of wanting to support a legend while being subjected to his deteriorating mental state. However, for observers like Verdine White, who prided themselves on emotional stability and group harmony, these incidents served as proof that Marvin had become a liability to the culture of black music. It was no longer about the songs, it was about the wreckage he left behind in the wings of the stage. By the end of that night, the damage to his reputation among his peers was significant. Word traveled fast in the industry, and stories of the backstage meltdown became a warning to others. The incident highlighted the growing divide between the professionals who treated music as a disciplined craft and the icons who had become lost in the vacuum of their own celebrity. For many, it was the moment they realized that the Marvin Gaye they admired on record no longer existed in the flesh. Instead, they were left with a man who had replaced his legendary soul with a defensive, erratic mask that made even his closest admirers want to keep their distance. Motown 25 and the man falling apart. By 1983, the music industry was preparing for a monumental celebration of its history. Motown 25. Yesterday, today, forever was meant to be a victory lap for the label that had defined the sound of young America. For the public, the highlight of the night was the reunion of the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson's legendary moonwalk. But for the veterans of the industry, all eyes were on Marvin Gaye. He had recently returned from a self-imposed exile in Belgium and scored a massive hit with Sexual Healing. On paper, it was the greatest comeback story in soul music history. Behind the scenes at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. When Marvin arrived for rehearsals, the contrast between the superstar and the man was jarring. The people who had known him for decades, including those in the Earth, Wind, and Fire circle, who valued physical and spiritual health above all else, were stunned by his appearance. Marvin looked physically drained, his eyes clouded by the weight of a life lived in a state of constant flight. His speech was often fragmented, and the air of paranoia that had haunted him for years seemed to have intensified. When it came time for his performance, Marvin took the stage alone at a piano. He delivered a soulful, rambling history of black music that felt more like a weary testimony than a rehearsed routine. To the millions watching at home, it was a moment of raw, unpolished genius. To the insiders watching from the wings, it was a display of profound fragility. There was a sense that he was holding himself together by a single thread. For disciplined professionals like Verdine White, watching a peer of such immense stature perform in such an unstable condition was likely a mixture of pity and professional frustration. It was a visible reminder that talent, no matter how great, provides no protection against emotional collapse. The temporary high of the Motown 25 comeback quickly evaporated, leading to the darkest chapter of his life. Marvin moved into his parents' home in Los Angeles, a decision that proved to be fatal. The house on Gramercy Place became a theater of psychological warfare. Marvin was trapped in a toxic cycle with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., a man who was deeply religious, strictly disciplined, and harboring his own long-standing resentments toward his famous son. The relationship was a powder keg. Marvin Sr. was a former minister who had a complicated relationship with his own identity and a history of explosive anger. Marvin Jr., struggling with the physical toll of his addictions and the mental toll of his fame, was in no state to navigate the minefield of his father's house. The two men represented a collision of two different types of brokenness. The son was a global icon who felt like a failure, and the father was a disciplinarian who felt overshadowed and disrespected by the very person he had raised. During these final months, Marvin's behavior reached a terrifying peak of instability. He was reportedly obsessed with his own mortality, frequently talking about death, and even asking his family members to end his life. He bought his father a pistol for protection, a gesture that was as ironic as it was tragic. The house was filled with constant shouting matches and physical confrontations. For the rest of the music world, including the highly organized and peaceful camp of Earth, Wind and Fire, the reports coming out of the Gaye household were incomprehensible. It was a level of domestic chaos that stood in total opposition to the messages of love and harmony that the soul era had supposedly championed. The end came on April 1st, 1984. Following a physical altercation between Marvin and his father, Marvin Sr. used the very gun his son had given him to shoot the singer at point-blank range. The news sent a shockwave through the world that froze every conversation in the industry. The Prince of Motown was gone, not at the hands of a stranger or the toll of his lifestyle, but at the hands of the man who had given him his name. In the aftermath, the industry moved quickly to transform Marvin Gaye into a martyr. The stories of his erratic behavior, the backstage humiliations, and the financial betrayals were largely swept under the rug to make room for the legend of the tragic genius. But for people like Verdine White, who had witnessed the decline up close, the death was not just a tragedy, it was a grim confirmation of the dangers of a life lived without structure or discipline. The violent end of Marvin Gaye served as a permanent marker of the divide between the music and the man. While the world mourned the loss of a voice, those who had survived the era alongside him were left to grapple with the memory of a collapse that everyone saw coming, but no one could stop. Many stars loved Marvin's music, but feared Marvin himself. The legacy of Marvin Gaye presents a profound paradox that the music industry has struggled to reconcile for decades. While his catalog remains a cornerstone of global culture, his life serves as a stark case study in the high cost of unchecked genius. Within the inner circles of R&B and funk, there was a growing realization that the industry often prioritizes the product over the person. Many stars admired Marvin's harmonic complexity but feared the man himself, recognizing that his presence brought a level of instability that could derail entire productions. This created a culture of enabling, where a star's destructive behavior was tolerated as long as the records continued to sell. For Verdine White and the members of Earth, Wind and Fire, the path was different. They chose a route of longevity through discipline, proving that Black excellence did not have to be synonymous with suffering or self-destruction. They stood as a living counter-argument to the myth of the tortured artist. The friction between Verdine's world and Marvin's world was not rooted in a lack of appreciation for music, but in a fundamental disagreement on how an artist should carry the weight of their influence. One represented the power of the collective, while the other represented the isolation of the individual. In the end, the question of whether Verdine White truly hated Marvin Gaye is likely misplaced. It was more likely a deep-seated disappointment. It was the frustration of a disciplined craftsman watching a peer succumb to a chaos that felt avoidable. The real tragedy is that while the public received the gift of Marvin's music, the man himself was lost in the process. Decades later, the songs of both Earth, Wind and Fire and Marvin Gaye continue to play side by side on every playlist. One brings the energy of a mountain that cannot be moved, and the other brings the haunting beauty of a storm that eventually blew itself out. We are left with the music, but those who lived through the era are left with a sobering reminder of the difference between being a legend and being a professional. What do you think about the divide between Marvin's chaos and the White brothers' discipline? Was one more authentic than the other? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.